Welcome, folks, to Lesson 6 in our study in the book of Daniel as a part of the prophecy series. Today, we're going to move into Daniel chapter 5. We're going to focus on verses 1 to 31. This is commonly known for the story of the writing on the wall. And what we're going to see is that now we're getting towards the end of the rule of the Babylonian Empire. We're at the end of that empire with a king by the name of Belshazzar, and the event that happened with him and Daniel's involvement with that event. Now, again, I've told you before when we looked at the introductory material with the book of Daniel that the historical record doesn't give us a day-by-day or moment-by-moment, year-by-year account of what's going on, but it is highlighting significant events that will help us in understanding the prophecies that are in the latter part of the book. So let's begin today, and we're going to take a look at these 31 verses in Daniel chapter 5. So we're going to begin with the first section, which would be Daniel chapter 5, verses 1 to 4, and the king's feast. So let's look at the text itself, and we'll start with verse 1 of chapter 5. King Belshazzar made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords and drank wine in front of the 1,000. Belshazzar, when he tasted the wine, commanded that the vessels of gold and of silver that Nebuchadnezzar his father had taken out of the temple in Jerusalem be brought, that the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. Then they brought the golden vessels that were taken out of the temple, the house of God, in Jerusalem, and the king and his lords and his wives and his concubines drank from them. They drank wine and praised the gods of gold, silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. Quite an interesting context of what's going on here. So let's begin by, first of all, looking at the feast that's taking place. The king's feast. We're going to see that, the setting described to us in Daniel chapter 5, verse 1. So Belshazzar was Nebuchadnezzar's grandson and co-regent with his father. So he's the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar. So Nebuchadnezzar at this point is gone. He's dead. But his father is a king by the name of Nabonidus. Now, Nabonidus ruled Babylon at this time. In fact, he restored some of the glory that had been from Nebuchadnezzar's reign back to Babylon. And at a certain point, he made his eldest son, Belshazzar, co-regent with him. So while he was away doing other things, his son would rule in Babylon itself, in the city Babylon itself, in his stead. Now, Belshazzar hosted a great feast for 1,000 of his officials. Now, that's some kind of a big festival going on here, that you've got 1,000 of your lords that are mentioned, not to mention everybody else who's with them, their wives and so forth. But here they are, they're having this great feast, and he's hosting it. Now, he makes a very unusual request. Now, it might not be unusual for them, but he asks for certain vessels to be used. And so what we're going to see in Daniel chapter 5, verses 2 to 3, is that the temple vessels are used. So the king commanded that the vessels from the temple be used at the feast. Now, do you remember back in Daniel chapter 1 when it described the conquest of Jerusalem, the captives being taken there, which those young men who were chosen to serve the king's service? But in that description about the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, it was recorded that Nebuchadnezzar took from the temple golden vessels and silver vessels. Now, these would be things that would have been dedicated to the Lord and would have been used as a part of the temple worship. So these are things that belong to the God of Israel. Well, Belshazzar, the king of Babylon, for some reason decides that he is commanding that these vessels be used in his feast. Now, there might be a lot of reasons why he's doing this. But remember, they are polytheistic people. And there is a rise of nationalism again. And so maybe he's rebelling against whatever the tone that was set by Nebuchadnezzar, where he acknowledged the Most High God. Usually you would use the vessels or things from a god of another nation to show your superiority. They're not sacred to you. Well, obviously he doesn't view the things that come from the temple in Jerusalem as sacred. And so what results in that, we're going to see in Daniel chapter 5, verse 4, is the worship of false gods. So the vessels were used for drinking wine as the false gods were praised. In fact, the text says it's the god of gold and the god of silver and the god of bronze and the god of iron. These are polytheistic people, and they're using the vessels that were dedicated to the worship of Yahweh for now the worship of these false gods. Well, that brings us to what is now a very interesting event that takes place while they're having this drunken festival. And we see it in Daniel chapter 5, verses 5 through 12. It's the appearance of the hand. The appearance of the hand. So let's take a look at this scripture together, and we're going to start in Daniel chapter 5, verse 5 through 12. Notice what verse 5 says. Immediately, the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace opposite the lampstand. And the king saw the hand as it wrote. Then the king's color changed, and his thoughts alarmed him. His limbs gave way, and his knees knocked together. The king called loudly to bring in the enchanters, the Chaldeans, and the astrologers. The king declared to the wise men of Babylon, "Whoever reads this writing and shows me its interpretation shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around his neck and shall be third ruler in the kingdom." Then all the king's wise men came in, but they could not read the writing or make known to the king the interpretation. Then King Belshazzar was greatly alarmed, and his color changed, and his lords were perplexed. The queen, because of the words of the king and his lords, came into the banqueting hall, and the queen declared, "O king, live forever. Let not your thoughts alarm you, or your color change. There is a man in your kingdom in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. In the day of your father, light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, were found in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king, made him chief of the magicians, enchanters, Chaldeans, and astrologers. Because an excellent spirit, knowledge, and understanding to interpret dreams, explain riddles, and solve problems were found in this Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar. Now let Daniel be called, and he will show you the interpretation." All right, and so let's begin by looking at this section of verses, Daniel 5, verse 5 through 12, as we discuss the appearance of the hand. And so the first thing we're going to notice is that verse 5 tells us about this hand. So, with the same hour, That same hour in which they were drinking from these vessels of God, with the same hour a hand appeared and wrote on the wall. So think about it. So here they are, they're having their great feast, 1,000 lords, all of the king's wives and his concubines. Now again, a concubine is a lesser wife. So here he is, he's having this drunken feast. He's commanded that the vessels of the temple be used. And while this is going on and they're being used and the gods of gold and silver and bronze and iron are praised, there appears a hand that wrote on the wall. And the king saw the hand. So wherever he was, he looks over on this wall opposite from where the lampstand is, and he sees this hand show up and write on the wall. And he's probably, well, the way it describes him, he's probably afraid. And so that's the next thing we're going to see here in Daniel chapter 5, verse 6, is the king's fear. So the king was struck with terror when he saw the handwriting on the wall. In fact, I like the way that the passage describes the king's fear. It says his knees were knocking. So obviously he was really bothered, traumatized, terrified by what he saw. And of course, with all things, you got to find out what it means. So there's this saying that's written on the wall by this mysterious hand that shows up. So the king's got to find out what it means. So notice now in Daniel chapter 5, verses 7 through 8, the interpretation is sought. And so what do they normally do in the Babylonian kingdom? What do the kings do? We saw this going all the way back with his grandfather, Nebuchadnezzar. Whenever he had a dream or something that he needed to have understanding, he would call for what? The wise men, the Chaldeans, the magicians, the soothsayers, whoever, to come and figure this out. So the king cried out for the wise men to come and interpret the writing. Now, this is a little bit different than a king describing to him a dream. There is literal writing on the wall, and they're supposed to come and give the interpretation. Well, here's the problem. The problem is the wise men were not able to read the writing and make the interpretation. So even though they could see for themselves this writing, these words, they don't know what it means. And they sure don't know what the interpretation is. So again, it brings the focus in the text back to the king. So when we get to Daniel chapter 5, verse 9, we're going to see that the king is troubled. And of course he would be. A hand shows up, writes on your wall some strange saying. You would be freaked out too, and nobody else can figure out what it means. It's going to bother you. So the king was visibly troubled, and others noticed it. In fact, it said that his color changed. Probably he was pale, frightened, scared, and everybody else saw it. So that brings in the queen, who obviously was not a part of this celebration. We see that in chapter 5, verses 10 through 12. We're going to see the queen's suggestion. So she comes in. The queen suggested that the king consult Daniel for the interpretation. So obviously, from the description of what's going on, Daniel must have been, he's obviously very old at this point, so this is 60-some years after he initially entered into service for Nebuchadnezzar. He's probably retired, or very few people consult him. He's not a part of the everyday life of King Belshazzar. But what we see happening now is that the queen is saying, hey, there's this guy who used to serve your father, is what the text says. Well, it's actually his grandfather. And he can give the interpretation. Call him. Ask him to give the interpretation. So she reminded the king of Daniel's service to Nebuchadnezzar. So she goes through, and it's probably, they all know the stories. They all know what happened with the first dream and with the second dream, and especially with the second dream. And so she's suggesting here, call Daniel. Well, that's exactly what they do. So when we come to verses 13 through 16 of chapter 5, we're going to see the king's request. So he obviously wants Daniel to come. So I want you to notice now what the scripture is saying here, starting with verse 13. Then Daniel was brought in before the king. The king answered and said to Daniel, "You are that Daniel, one of the exiles of Judah, whom the king my father brought from Judah. I have heard that you had the spirit of the gods in you, and that light and understanding and excellent wisdom are found in you. Now the wise men, the enchanters, have been brought in before me to read this writing and make known to me its interpretation, but they could not show me the interpretation of the matter. But I have heard that you can give interpretations and solve problems. Now, if you can read the writing and make known to me its interpretation, you shall be clothed with purple and have a gold chain around your neck, and you shall be the third ruler in the kingdom." So let's take a look at what's going on here. So let's start off, first of all, in chapter 5, verse 13. Daniel is brought to the king. So what we see here is Daniel's brought before the king. So they probably had to go out and get him from somewhere. He probably lived in the city, but they made haste. The king wanted him immediately. This is something urgent. And they bring Daniel in before the king. And notice now, maybe it's just simply a formality. Again, I think it's because Belshazzar doesn't know who Daniel is because he's not a part of everyday life in the kingdom anymore. I mean, we're talking 60-some years later. The king questions his identity. So, of course, there's the whole issue of Daniel's reputation that we see in Daniel chapter 5, verse 14. And what we see here is obviously the king knows something about him, so the king recalls his past service and reputation. So with that comes a question, an appeal. And we see that in Daniel chapter 5, verse 15 through 16, the request for the interpretation. That's why they've brought Daniel here. It's for him to say, what is this writing? What does it mean? The king asked Daniel to read the writing if he can. So the king's not sure if he can do it because nobody else can do it. But he's saying, if you can read this, tell me what the writing is. The king would reward him for interpreting the writing. So again, notice now he would be given something purple to wear. That would be a color of royalty. And clothes were very special back then. He would have a gold chain around his neck. And again, that would be very significant. And then he would be made a third ruler in the empire. Now, a lot of people have been perplexed by that because the scripture doesn't say that Belshazzar is a co-ruler with his father Nabonidus. But if you understand from history that he is, that would make sense. The first ruler is Nabonidus, then second ruler, Belshazzar, and then Daniel then would be elevated to a position of being the next person in charge. So that's going to bring us to chapter 5, verse 17 through 28, where we see Daniel's interpretation. Of course, Daniel, being gifted by God with regards to the issue of dreams, he can give an interpretation. So notice what the text tells us starting in verse 17. Then Daniel answered and said before the king, "Let your gifts be for yourself, and give your rewards to another. Nevertheless, I will read the writing to the king and make known to him the interpretation. O king, the Most High God gave Nebuchadnezzar, your father, kingship and greatness and glory and majesty. And because of the greatness that he gave him, all peoples, nations, and languages trembled and feared before him. Whom he would, he killed, and whom he would, he kept alive. Whom he would, he raised up, and whom he would, he humbled. But when his heart was lifted up and his spirit was hardened, so that he dealt proudly, he was brought down from his kingly throne, and his glory was taken from him. He was driven from among the children of mankind, and his mind was like that of a beast, and his dwelling was with the wild donkeys. He was fed grass like an ox, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, until he knew that the Most High God rules the kingdom of mankind and sets over it whom he will. And his son Belshazzar have not humbled your heart, though you knew all this. But you lifted up yourself against the Lord of heavens, and the vessels of his house have been brought in before you and your lords, your wives, and your concubines have drunk wine from them. You have praised the gods of silver and gold, and of bronze, iron, and wood and stone, which do not see or hear or know, but the God in whose hand is your breath, and whose are all your ways, you have not honored. Then from his presence the hand was sent, and this writing was inscribed. And this is the writing that was inscribed: Mene, Mene, Tekel, and Parsin. This is the interpretation of the matter. Mene, God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. Peres, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. Wow. So let's take a look at this interpretation and the interaction here. And what we're going to see is some boldness from Daniel. Because again, he's appearing before somebody who holds his life in his hands. But at this point, Daniel has served the Lord for how many decades now? And he's not really worried. So notice what we see in chapter 5, verse 17, the refusal of the reward. So Daniel tells the king to keep his reward. So remember now, the king's offering him the third position in the kingdom, a gold chain, nice clothes. And he's like, hey, you keep your reward. Why? Because this is a writing of judgment. And so we're going to see that in chapter 5, verses 18 through 21. Nebuchadnezzar's judgment is recalled before Belshazzar is judged. So Daniel reminds the king of the judgment that God placed on Nebuchadnezzar. Now, again, which judgment is that? That's referring back to Daniel chapter 4. Remember Nebuchadnezzar's second dream? His being driven out from among men, living in the wild for a period of 7 years until he came to his senses. Him not grooming and him basically living like an animal, eating like an animal. Well, of course, his family would know that story. Belshazzar should know that story, and Daniel even points that out here. So he reminds the king of his judgment and why it took place. But he points out the issue that Belshazzar is having. So when you come to chapter 5, verses 22 to 23, we see the king's pride and sin. Because Belshazzar is doing the same thing. So Daniel points out the king's pride and his sin against God by profaning the vessels of the temple. So think about it. Daniel is saying, look, this is because you profane the God of heaven, the Most High God, the God of Israel. You used his vessels from his temple to worship all of these gods that are nothing. And because of that, that happened because of your pride and your sin. So here's the judgment. And we see that now being brought forth in chapter 5, verses 24 to 28, where Daniel gives the writing of judgment. So here's what he starts off by saying. He says, Daniel tells the king that the hand and the writing are from God. So this is something that God is directly communicating. The Most High God is directly communicating to the king. And God has pronounced judgment on his kingdom. So this isn't just a judgment upon the king himself. This is a judgment upon the entire kingdom of Babylon, the world empire that is there. And so here's what he says. He reads the inscription and he says that God has measured the king and found him lacking. God is the one who is the ultimate judge, and he finds that King Belshazzar is lacking. He also states that he has given the kingdom to the Medes and Persians. Now, what we don't know from the biblical text is that at this point in the history of Babylon, they are at war with another empire, another rising empire to the north, which is the kingdom of the Medes and the Persians. We call it the Medo-Persian Empire. And so this judgment is basically saying that God has given the kingdom of Babylon to the Medes and the Persians. In fact, while this incident is taking place, the Medo-Persians have surrounded Babylon. But they feel pretty secure because they have a river that's flowing right through them. They feel pretty secure in that they're going to be okay, even though they're under siege. Why would you have a feast unless you're thinking that you're okay? But God has announced that he has given the kingdom to the Medes and the Persians. So then when we come to the last part of chapter 5 verses 29 to 31, we see that the prophecy is fulfilled. We see that the writing and what was stated there comes true. So notice with me verse 29. Then Belshazzar gave the command, and Daniel was clothed with purple, and a chain of gold was put around his neck, and a proclamation was made about him that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom. That very night, Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was killed. And Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. Now, let's take a look at what's happening here. So first of all, when we come to chapter 5, verse 29, even though Daniel had said he didn't want it, Daniel is rewarded. So Daniel is rewarded by being made the third ruler of the kingdom, which, by the way, Daniel obviously didn't matter to him because he knew before the night's over, it's not going to matter what he is as far as the rulership. There isn't going to be a kingdom anymore. But hey, he's made the third ruler. Now, when we get to verse 30, chapter 5, not much is said, but Belshazzar that very night is killed. Belshazzar is killed that very evening. Now, what history tells us is that the Medo-Persians, when they came against the city, how they breached the city is that they had the river Euphrates diverted. Because the river flowed through the city, they had the river, and it must have taken them a long period of time to do this, had the river diverted, and so therefore the armies could come into the city on both ends of the city because there was no more water going through, and they could enter the city and take the city. And when they took the city, they killed the king of Babylon, Belshazzar. So then that brings us to chapter 5, verse 31, where the kingdom, the Babylonian kingdom, is defeated. So the Babylonian Empire was defeated by Darius, king of the Medo-Persian Empire. And the text tells us he was 62 years old. And that brings us to the end of Daniel chapter 5. Now, next week, when we get into our next lesson and we move into Daniel chapter 6, we see now that Daniel is going to be serving the king of the Medo-Persian Empire. And that brings us to our next well-known story before we get into the prophecies that are in the rest of the book of Daniel.